Good morning, everyone. It's the seventh Sunday of Easter. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. Death is a mystery. Death is something it seems so strange. Literally, a person can be with us in a moment, talking, alive, and in the next, the person is gone. The breath is gone. The shining of the eyes is gone. We don't understand it. Where has the person gone? What has happened to the breath? It just doesn't come back. A person is here, and then the person is not here. Where did he go? A person who dies does not get better. If we have a sore throat and we're coughing, we go to the doctor and the doctor says, oh, you've got bronchitis, and we get some antibiotics, and in a couple of days we'll begin to feel better. If you walk down some stairs and you fall and you break your leg will be put into a cast for 6 weeks, and it will heal. And where it heals, it'll be stronger than the rest of the leg. Everything will be better. If you get an infection on your finger, you can soak it in hot water and Epsom salts, and that will draw the infection out. And before you know it, your finger is healed. But it's not so with death. Death seems to be final. I remember years ago, I'd watch cartoons with my kids, and there would be, I think it was Daffy Duck, and they were quite violent, actually, and I remember he'd be pounded into the ground with a mallet. The duck would be flat as a pancake, and we say, well, that's the end of him. And yet a moment later, as soon as the other character turned his back, poof, it was as if he was filled up with air suddenly, and he was alive again. But that's not the case with death. And because of this strangeness of it, because we don't understand it, we honor the dead. I remember as a boy, every so often, maybe 2, 3, 4 times a year, my mother would say to my father, why don't we take a ride up to the cemetery? And we would get in the car and go for maybe 50 minutes up to Kensico Cemetery. And we would visit the graves of our relatives. My mother would pull weeds from the graves of her parents and tidy up stuff, maybe water some things. And then she'd say, all right, let's go walking. And she remembered where all the other relatives were buried, and maybe some other folks from the church, and we'd go wandering around. We could spend easily an hour up there before we came back. We remembered the dead. We honored them. Back in my home church on All Saints Sunday, the pastor would read the names of all of the people in the congregation who had died that past year. We would all stand there quietly, listening to the names. And since the congregation was quite large and elderly, there were a number of names each year, as I recall. Several days ago, we were watching the computer, and a group of people had gotten together, and they were reading the names of those people in New York City who had died from the coronavirus. It went on and on for hours because there were thousands of names to be read. But they didn't want these people simply to be forgotten. They had gotten sick. They had died. But we honored them. This weekend, we also honor our dead soldiers. It's Memorial Day on Monday, and it's a time where we remember those who have sacrificed their lives for our freedom. We wouldn't be here in the present situation we're in if it were not for our soldiers. And so we give thanks. We wouldn't be having barbecues on Monday if it weren't for the soldiers, if we had not had them die. Jesus also sacrificed himself, not so that we could have a barbecue, but rather so that we might be reconciled to God, so that death would not be the final end of us, but rather our relationship with God would be the end. We would forever be related to him. Our sins are forgiven through the crucifixion of Jesus. This was God's mysterious way of reconciling us to himself. And then, of course, came the resurrection, which sealed the deal. The first sign that something was different following this crucifixion was when the women on Sunday morning decided to go to the tomb and honor Jesus' body. They wanted to prepare it properly for burial, and they were bringing along the spices that they needed. And when they got to the tomb, they found that it was not as they thought it would be. The stone had been rolled away. And when they peered inside, there was no body. He was not there. And then an angel said to them, "Who are you looking for? Jesus is not here. Do not seek the living among the dead." I'm sure they were astonished. They were surprised. They didn't know what to think. This was the first sign that something was happening. But if it were the only sign of Jesus' resurrection, it would not be enough. Because it would be quite possible, you see, that the body had been stolen or moved. When Mary comes to the tomb in the Gospel of John and it's empty, she weeps. And when somebody calls to her, she says, "Oh, sir," and she thinks it's the gardener. She says, "Tell me, where have you moved Jesus' body? I want to see him yet." The idea was that perhaps the body was moved. The Jews were also worried about that. And so they went to Pilate and they said, he said he was going to rise from the dead in 3 days. Please make sure that his disciples don't steal the body and move it and pretend that he is risen from the dead. We need to watch over the tomb. And so if this were the only thing, you see, it would not be sufficient. But something else happened. On that first Sunday evening, the disciples were visited by the living Christ. They were all gathered in a room, and all of a sudden Jesus was there, and he said, look at my hands, look at my feet, see the imprints of the nails. Look at my side. It is I, the one who was crucified. And the following Sunday, he appeared again, this time specifically to Thomas, who was not there the first time. "Thomas, look at my hands, look at my feet. Feel my side. It is I. Do not be doubting, but believe. And in many different ways, Jesus appeared to his disciples. This by itself would also be suspect, because one could say, well, you're hallucinating. You heard Jesus say that he was going to rise, and so you wanted it so badly that you begin to see him. And yes, there is such a thing as mass hallucinations too, where a group of people could also see him. But that's you see, not the case, because we have both the empty tomb and we have the appearances of Jesus. And the disciples were so convinced by this that they left everything else and could only talk about the resurrection and what it meant, how God has reconciled his people to himself through Jesus. Jesus is now alive. And because of the empty tomb and the appearances, they're convinced of it. For 40 days, Jesus appeared to them. And then on this 40th day, it's now a Thursday. And it's not emphasized by the church that much because it's not a Sunday. And so sometimes we skip over this day, but we should not, because it's an important day. It's the day of Jesus' ascension. So the disciples are all together with Jesus. And they ask him, are you now going to reconstitute Israel? Reconstitute everything, because they thought that this was what the Messiah was going to do. They still have this old notion. The Messiah was to come and kick out the Romans, was going to renew the temple, and was going to begin his rule and set up God's kingdom again. And Jesus says, no, it's not up to me to know the time when this is going to be done. This is up to God. But they continue then. And when they get to the Mount of Olives, Jesus begins to be drawn up to heaven. We today would ask a question that we really can't ask of what happened. We would like to know the propulsion system. How did he go up? What caused it? Or was he drawn up to heaven, say like the tractor beam in the Star Trek films? We can't ask those questions because that's not what Luke, who's the writer of this, is trying to tell us. He's really trying to tell us that through this act, Jesus is returning to God. No longer will there be any more appearances. They're coming to an end. And he's returning to God, and they watch as he goes up to into the sky until he's finally hidden by a cloud. We can't say that heaven is there. The first cosmonaut that went up to circle the earth came back and said, there is no heaven. I didn't see it. Well, we didn't expect that. And it was foolish of him to even say that. And did the disciples believe also that heaven was there? I doubt it. We today, even though we don't believe that, will sometimes speak in those terms. You've heard someone say, well, I'll bet Mom is looking down on us now, laughing her fool head off, as if she is up in heaven someplace. But that's a figure of speech. And heaven is in another dimension that is as close to us as we are to ourselves. We don't know exactly what it is, but we believe now that the ascension means that Jesus is with God, and he is now seated at the right hand of God. Not physically. There's no throne where God sits and he sits right next to him. These, again, are figures of speech. But Jesus has returned to God. He is now the Lord over everything. He has conquered death, and he is the Lord of the earth, the Lord of our universe, and he is in control of our future. It was back in 1941 that Dorothy Sayers gave a lecture. And in this lecture, she said, Jesus had many good ideas. And Jesus gave us many principles by which we should live. But if these were the only things that we have, they would be useless. They wouldn't be worthwhile to keep us going. We need more than that. We need to know that Jesus was both human and divine. If he were only man, what he said would be irrelevant concerning God, because he wouldn't know. And if he were only God, it would be irrelevant about what he said about humankind, because he wouldn't understand what it meant to be human. But he's both. And she insisted on this, that this is what we need at this time during the war, you see. And we believed that he was crucified and that he was raised. And furthermore, that he ascended back to God. He ascended back to God to prepare a place for us, to prepare a place for our beloved dead, our relatives, and those whom we don't know, who have also died. Our future is in God's hands, the future of all of us, and the future is good. God has guaranteed it through the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Amen.